Okay, and I'm gonna share my screen as usual, and we will get started. So to double check, everyone can hear me? Everybody can see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so I know during our last session, we started off with looking at the city. If you guys remember, we did like an overview. What we did there is something that is called a comparative analysis in literature. So if you follow on, if you go through to university, if you follow English literature in the future at a higher level, you will learn that these are methods of analyzing certain texts, and this is called a comparative analysis, where you sort of look at multiple texts together and compare and contrast, right? And I took a look at your A-level papers as well. I took a look at your past papers, and I saw that your questions do have this kind of analysis, right? It's less of explicating one text and more of drawing from like a few different ones and then seeing how it goes, right? So it's good for you to learn this mode, and I hope that this is helpful. So last time we looked at 3 different poems that depicted what we call the cityscape or the urban landscape, right? Today, we're going to be looking at 2 different poems which are having a focus on the natural world. So last time it was a city. This time we're going to look at the natural world in poetry, right? So moving on, let's see. So we're looking at poems of 2 particular ages. Now remember in our last session we discussed about, let me just lift this guy a bit here. In our last session we discussed about English or British poets of different eras, right? We looked at the Romantic era and we looked at the Modernist period, but it was specifically in British poetry, right? We were looking at 3 different poets in the British canon. So this session, we're going to be looking at one more Romantic poet plus a Modernist poet. They are also belonging to those 2 eras, but with certain differences in style and the handling of subject matter. So we're looking at William Wordsworth and we're looking at Robert Frost. So the 2 poems which were in the title slide as well, we're looking at To a Snowdrop and Design, right? So just to tell you guys, just to recap as well, we looked at the urban landscape or the cityscape last time. Now we're looking this time at how the natural landscape is portrayed in these poems, and we're going to look at how does romanticism as a tradition feature in these, or look at like how do they sort of explore their themes, and how does the modernist tradition come through, right? So like I mentioned before as well, we're approaching literatures through what is called a comparative analysis. So which is you compare and contrast either through theme, subject matter, style, or in some sort of commonality, right? So let's see what we have here. Now, I have a refresher for you guys because we were talking about Romanticism and Modernism last time. So the Romantics, as we discussed, were during this era from the 1780s to the 1830s, and the Modernists came later from the 1900s to the 1950s. But in between, now these are 2 separate periods we're looking at, but in between there were other periods. There was the Victorian era, and if you look, they're not super predominant periods, but there were also other eras called the Edwardian and Georgian eras. And you can see these names, Victorian, Edwardian, and Georgian. They're all classified by the reigns of British monarchs. So it's essentially after the kings and queens. So Queen Victoria, Victorian era, King Edward, King George, Edwardian and Georgian eras. So they are specific to Britain because obviously America didn't have a monarchy. So these kind of eras in literature did exist, but that's how British literature is sort of divided into subcategories, right? So there were the Romantics, there were the Modernists, as we were talking about. Now, since we discussed most of this last time, I'm just going to get you guys to quickly give me a recap and let me have somebody read out. Can we have Methuli read out what the Romantic era was about?
The Romantics, 1780s to 1830s, focus on nature, emotion, imagination, individualism, and the sublime connection to nature, reaction against industrialization. Key figures: William Blake, early romantic, often seen as visionary who made way for the movement. William Wordsworth, lyrical ballads. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, John Keats. American counterpart, Transcendentalism,
Okay.
Walt Whitman, Emerson, and Dickinson.
Okay, thanks, Mithuli. So, two things here. One, the romantic period, if you really look at it as a period. Now, last time we were discussing Blake, remember? But Blake is one of the very early romantics. Technically, he's kind of out of the official romantic period, but because of his writing and his themes and all of that, he's broadly brought into the romantics as a whole. But the romantic period is generally seen to have started with William Wordsworth and his publication of this book called the Lyrical Ballads. So that was supposed to be the starting point of the romantic era, because William Wordsworth, in this book, he's the one who laid out kind of like the philosophy of the romantic movement, what poetry should be, what sort of themes they're looking at, what their philosophy is. So that's why Wordsworth is known as the key figure of the romantic movement, but Blake preceded him. But obviously he's a very big part of the romantics, like we discussed last time, right? So in America also had a romantic movement. Now these are English literature, but literature in two different regions, right? So in America, the Romantic movement coincided a lot with what is called Transcendentalism. So some key figures of that are Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, if you've heard of those writers. So just keep those things in mind as well. Now, can we quickly have, let's see, maybe Kinori read out the modernists and give us the summary of the modernist era?
The modernists: experimental forms, disillusionment after World War I, alienation, focus on desolate internal emotional states, urbanization, themes of isolation, loss, and the struggle for meaning. Break from traditional forms using free verse, focusing on imagism and urban fragmented experiences. Key figures: T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, W.B. Yeats in Britain, Europe. In America, Robert Frost, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams.
Okay, thanks, Kinori. So the reason I'm breaking these down for you is just to give you the idea that there is the idea of American literature and the idea of British literature, which broadly we study all of them together, but they are I wouldn't say two different canons, but they are two different branches, right? So as opposed to the romantics, as you can see, who had a focus, as we discussed, on nature, connection to deep emotion, like sort of, it was coming about as a reaction against industrialization. So it was a lot about man and nature and connecting to like the deeper emotions of life, right? Whereas the modernists, obviously in a post-World War or a post-World War context, I want to say World War and post-World War. So they were obviously talking about the themes of disillusionment with the world, breaking down of the world order, and alienation, urbanization, people feeling lost for meaning. And I find this interesting because I feel like this is something that we are kind of like our era at the moment with what is erupting around us. We're kind of experiencing similar themes and similar feelings. So let's see how all of these figure, right? And like I said, there were key figures in Britain like T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Yeats in Ireland. But in America, there were these other poets like Robert Frost, William Carlos Williams, and Frost is who we're going to be looking at today from America, right? Now moving on. Like I was trying to tell you guys, I just pulled this up on the screen so that you would be able to see that. In this timeline, you can see that there are the British literary periods, there are the American literary periods. Don't go to think too much about this, but I just put it there to show you how Britain is kind of divided according to these different categories like Victorian, Edwardian, and the corresponding ones. So you can see here. So there's a romantic period happening in this era, and in America, the Romanticism started a bit later, and it was during this time that this transcendentalist movement was happening, right? So there's the Victorian, Edwardian, and Georgian, like we were talking about in the UK, in Britain, and modernism kind of coincides. It's at the same times, and postmodernism as well. So just something to think about, right? I did also pull this up. Let's see if it comes. Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is something you guys can explore on your own time later on. But I just wanted to show you how, like, the different movements and how it moves through time, right? So as you can see there you go in pink, you have the romantic period here. And at the same time over here in Charles Dickens, they are the ones who are during the Victorian era writing about the books that we were talking. Remember last time we were discussing Dickens' London? And so you kind of can see how literature moves through the ages, and the link is up there, and I can send it to you separately. Take a look. It looks a bit overwhelming, I know, but it kind of gives you a good idea of how the different texts are positioned in that timeline of literature overall, right? Now, let me see. We did this, and we moved on, and let's move to our next slide. Okay, so what I wanted to sort of build up and bring you guys into is the idea that I want you to remember as you progress through poetry or any type of literary text, there can always be stylistic differences, even in individual poets or writers belonging to the same literary era, right? So for example, here you can see both Blake and Wordsworth, who are very proudly declaring, like, we are the romantics. But we remember that Blake had a focus more on, like, mystical vision, social critique, and the idea of the imagination. Whereas Wordsworth, as we will get to know, he was more into, he's known for celebrating nature's restorative power and this idea of the sublime, right? So poetry, he defines poetry, and I think this is something from the Lyrical Ballads that we were talking about, the book that laid out the philosophy of the Romantic movement. He describes poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions, right? And then we have the modernists. So over here, we have T.S. Eliot, we have Robert Frost, Eliot from Britain, Robert Frost from America. But what are their differences? So they were both modernist in the exploration of the fractured, sort of disillusioned 20th century experience. However, we'll get to see that while Eliot focused very strongly on the modern urban landscape, like we were looking at last time, the city, London, the depictions, Frost is very well known for his rustic imagery. Frost is all about sort of like the village scenes, natural world. It's all about nature, right? But in a very fragmented, disillusioned sense. So let's see how these all play out in the poems. So what I want you to remember is that literary eras, just remember them, that they are not set in stone. They're just broad categorizations. And often the start and end dates of literary eras are also debated. So some say it's on 1 year, another person says, no, it started on a different year later. So it's just a general guide to remember. But what is most important is that you need to try to think for yourself, what does it mean when you say that a writer is a modernist writer versus a romantic writer? So I want you to think of this and keep this question in your head, because I'm going to come back to it later when we are getting to the end of the presentation, right? Okay, so moving on. Now we're going to look at To a Snowdrop today. That's by William Wordsworth, as we know. And as we're going to read the poem, I want you to think about the color white. Okay, the images, the symbolism, and think about the feeling. Now, the Romantics talk a lot about this idea of the sublime, which is a sort of spiritual connection, like this sublime sort of transcendental feeling. Remember, we spoke about transcendentalism in America. It's something similar that the Americans were picking up over there, right? So this idea of the sublime, how does sublime feeling come through in these poems? And think, what feelings do you think the poet is feeling towards nature? Okay, is the natural phenomenon here portrayed as beautiful, magical, or scary? Like, all questions for you to think about. So I've put a little picture here of this is our dog Ruby. We went out looking for snowdrops for you guys. So I actually went to the woods looking for some snowdrops because I thought it'll be nice to actually see and picture what the flower is like. So let's move on to reading the poem. Okay, so this is a video I took in the woods. So there you can see the actual snowdrops. And now listen while I read, okay? So, To a Snowdrop by William Wordsworth. Lone flower, hemmed in with snows and white as they, but hardier far. Once more I see thee bend thy forehead, as if fearful to offend, like an unbidden guest. Though day by day storms sallying from the mountain tops waylay the rising sun, and on the plains descend, yet art thou welcome, welcome as a friend whose zeal outruns his promise. Blue-eyed May shall soon behold this border thickly set with bright jonquils, the odors lavishing on the soft west wind and his frolic peers, nor will I then thy modest grace forget, chaste snowdrop, venturous harbinger of spring and pensive monitor of fleeting years. Okay, I've highlighted a few words here just for us to come back to and then think about afterwards. But let's move on to the next slide for a minute. Okay, so I've got pulled up for you guys some interesting snowdrop folklore. Okay, so apparently in floriography, which is the Victorian language of flowers, snowdrops represented as a symbol, hope or consolation, right? But as I was reading up on this, I came across this very interesting thing. Apparently, they also had more sinister connotations, right? So because snowdrops traditionally used to grow a lot in woodlands and in churchyards and graveyards, bringing them inside the house, apparently there's a myth that it could cause misfortune, and also seeing a single snowdrop signified impending death. Now, I'm not saying that this is what Wordsworth was getting at, but do remember that in the poem he sees a lone snowdrop, right? Not a bunch of it, not many snowdrops, but one single snowdrop. Just something to keep in mind. So folk names for snowdrops include the flower of hope, little sister of the snows, fair maids of February, snow piercer, that's interesting, dingle dangle, and also death flower. Okay, now as you can see, when you see the picture of the snowdrop, especially in its early stages, you can see where Wordsworth is drawing that imagery, that the forehead drooping and the sort of head of the flower bowing. It's important to kind of visualize these flowers and actually do a Google search or something and look at it for ourselves, because these are not familiar to us in a Sri Lankan context, right? Like most of the time we have no idea what these foreign references are to flowers and trees and different things that they're talking about. So if you look at the flower, you can see it has a tendency, it doesn't stay straight on its stalk. It's always drooping. That's why Wordsworth references it like that, right? So I've also pulled up another interesting fact that, remember last time we were talking about how Blake wrote about the chimney sweeper in two different contexts. Wordsworth also writes quite a bit about snowdrops. So he has written one poem that we just read, and then he has another called On Seeing a Tuft of Snowdrops in a Storm. So look at the imagery here too, like these frail snowdrops that together cling and nod their helmets. Again, that idea of nodding and the head down, right? So here he's talking about a cluster of snowdrops, and he has another one here called Who Fancied What a Pretty Sight. So there as well, the snowdrop imagery is so prevalent. Who fancied what a pretty sight this rock would be if edged around with living snowdrops, circlet bright. So the snowdrops have grown around the rock, almost as if they are like a flower crown or like a little circlet of flowers, like very pretty imagery. But just the idea that snowdrops and this images was something that Wordsworth kept returning to over and over again, right? So moving on to some of the form, techniques and themes of this poem. Now, obviously you've studied this in class, so you must know that this is in sonnet form, right? It's in the form of a Petrarchan sonnet. So what's a Petrarchan sonnet and how is this different from Elizabethan sonnets? So Petrarchan sonnets were an essentially sonnet is little song, just so you know. The term sonnet means little song. So this was a form perfected by the Italian poet Petrarch. It was created by others, and there were other people writing about it. But Petrarch was the one who perfected it, because I think he wrote, I want to say 700, either 300 or 700 poems, Petrarchan sonnets, on this one woman called Laura. So he wrote an unbelievable number of sonnets for this lady. So he was the one who created this idea of the sonnet as something that is traditionally focused on love, the beloved, or like idealized beauty, right? And as we know, a sonnet divides, the form divides the sonnet into, the 14 lines are divided into an octave and a sestet. So there's 8 lines at first and then the 6 lines afterwards. And generally the rhyming pattern is C, D, C, D, C, D, and then C, D, E, C, D, E. So there is a general structure that it follows. Now, what's a volta? This idea of the volta is where right after the 8th line, the moment you get to the sestet, there is usually a dramatic shift in tone or argument or focus. So there's a clear break. There's one octave and the sestet, and there's like a break which is marked by this technique, or like this structural part of it called the volta. So this is where the poem shifts from presenting a problem or an argument to resolving it. Okay? And sorry, this is not the case. This was supposed to be for Frost. So ignore this. I will get back to it later. Remind me if I forget. But ignore this line. And let's see what. So apart from that, the themes of this poem. So you must have studied this in school. So obviously it's about the resilience and the strength of nature, where a single flower is rising up from the snow, and it's appearing really delicate, but very intriguingly, it's hardier far. That means it's much more hardy and much more stronger than the surrounding snow, which is sort of like, let's go back to the poem a little bit. It's depicted almost in the language of warfare, right? There are storms that are sallying from the mountaintops, like they waylay the rising sun, and it's sort of like almost like an army, a winter army just gathering. If you watch Game of Thrones, you would really relate to this image, the giant army just coming through winter, and it kind of gives an idea like that, right? Storms sallying from the mountaintops, they are waylaying the rising sun, just even covering and, I don't know, beating up the rising sun. And on the plains, they're descending. So this much of power in contrast to the snowdrop, but still the snowdrop manages to rise up through all of this and thrive, right? So like we were saying here, there is clearly the idea of, where is that? The resilience and strength of nature, and also the snowdrop becomes a very clear symbol of renewal and hope, right? And how does Wordsworth bring across this idea? Clearly through that phrase itself, harbinger of spring. So the snowdrop is, in spite of all these storms and the wintry mess, the snowdrop is sort of the messenger. He's giving this message of optimism and hope that things are going to be okay despite of all this bleakness, right? And then there's the idea of purity and modesty. So when you're looking back at the poem, go back and focus on the description, on the use of the color white. How has white been portrayed here? There's this idea of chaste. What is chaste? Chastity. So there's the idea of purity, chastity, almost like those traditional things that I want to say maybe the Elizabethan or even the Petrarchan kind of like Italian type of idealized beauty, that idea of a pure sort of like a maiden that is untouched and all chaste and pure and all of this, that sort of imagery is going on here. And associated with the color white, obviously. And then there's the cycles of time and life, which while the poem goes through, that's the sonnet form and in the octave and the sestet, you can almost see the cycle of seasons and the cycle of life happening, right? There are very transitory, the storms are coming and then the snowdrop is coming through it, and so the snowdrop is also sort of like a observer or watcher of passing time or years, because he calls it a, what is it, a monitor, let's go back to the poem. What does he say? Virtuous harboring and pensive monitor. So the snowdrop is a monitor, fleeting year. So he's a watcher. And this is interesting because look how the snowdrop is personified. In the last session we were talking about, remember how the poet or the writer is an observer or the watcher? Now here there's an interesting image brought out here through personification, where the lone snowdrop that is coming out of the snow is becoming the observer of the seasons and watching everything that's going on, right? So a few of the techniques here you would know would be, I think it's in the next slide, so let me just proceed to that afterwards. But looking at that, we can also see that nature, how is nature portrayed? Is it portrayed, now we were asking the questions earlier, is nature portrayed more as beautiful, magical, mystical, or is there an element of scariness or danger? What about in this particular poem? It's clearly nature is shown as very gentle and comforting, right? So the flower eases the speaker's pensive breast, and it gives this sense of calm and solace, right? But look also how the contrast happens between those two sections right before and after the volta, right, in the octave and the sestet. So in the first part of the poem, of the sonnet, in the octave, you can see this imagery of white and this kind of imagery of warfare. Snowdrop, snows, everything is white. It's like an entirely white world, right? Even though there's a reference to the sun, he's being waylaid by the snow, and if you look at the imagery, it's predominantly white color, sort of like a image that is being created. But then what happens when by the time it gets to the sestet, immediately there's a contrast because it introduced this idea of the jonquil flowers. So immediately there are the jonquils. So jonquils, as you know, are a kind of daffodils. They are less vibrant than the bright yellow daffodils, but they are harbingers of spring more than the snowdrop, I would say. The snowdrop appears in winter. Now that's a peculiarity about the flower. It actually appears in the heart of winter and it dies towards spring. The moment spring is arriving, the snowdrop actually withers and the plant dies. Whereas jonquils are the start of spring. They are the announcers. Okay, spring has come. Look at us. We're breaking out into flower. And from that white imagery, suddenly there is bright yellow or bright orangish yellow imagery coming through, right? So things for you to think about. Go back to the poem later and spot these techniques. What I was trying to show earlier was you would know the idea of apostrophe, which is where you're addressing an object, and before he moves on to personify the snowdrop and actually embody it with human qualities, he addresses it first. So it's like lone flower or lone snowdrop, right? So then look at also the idea of personification. If I think in the poem there is the personification of the snowdrop, but there was also personification of the winds. I think the winds, let's go back there again and take a look. So one thing, look at blue-eyed May. So May, the month of May becomes personified. It's like a blue-eyed damsel or something, right? And then look at the soft wind and his frolic peers. So the soft wind and his peers or acquaintances or friends who are joining with him in his game. So frolic is kind of like to play around playfully, kind of. So there again you get personification. The wind is personified. The month of May is personified. So a couple of those things, in addition to the snowdrop, there's other personification as well, right? What else were our techniques? And look again at the visual symmetry and the visual imagery and the symbolism, right? Also, you would have sensed the tactile and the olfactory sort of imagery being created there. How is it olfactory? The the heavy scent of jonquils, the smell of jonquil flowers coming in the wind, and then the tactile feelings of all of those elements of wind and flowers moving and the snowstorms. Like it's created very beautiful sound. Wordsworth is clearly a nature poet. He draws his inspiration from nature. He looks to nature to pull those sort of like images of the sublime from, and that's how he creates his work, right? So look also for the ideas of alliteration and similes and metaphors. So I'm not going to go through the poem and point out the techniques to you one by one. You can go through it and revisit it yourself. And if you do have any questions, just drop me a message next time, or we can revisit it afterwards, right? So, which brings us to the next poem that we were looking at, which is Design. Okay, Design by Robert Frost, again a modernist, and we're going to follow a similar approach that we did in the first poem as well. So the same questions, the same points. As you read the poem, think about the color white, the images of white, and the symbolism in the poem. What feelings do you think this poet is feeling towards nature? When he looks at nature, is he experiencing the same kind of experience that Wordsworth is feeling, right? And we spoke of the modernist era. We spoke of the common themes of the modernist era and the kinds of emotions or sort of preoccupations they have. Look at what sort of modernist era emotions or themes that you can pick up when you're reading this, right? And then think about how this natural phenomenon is portrayed in Frost's poem. So is it again beautiful, mystical? Does it have that sense of the sublime, that everything happens perfectly in accordance with like greater laws? Or is there a sense of some sort of danger, some sort of feelings of fear or trepidation? Really keep an eye out for those as you look at the next one. Okay, so there is Design for you. Let's take a look at what Design is trying to say. Okay, Design by Robert Frost. I found a dimpled spider, fat and white, on a white heel-all, holding up a moth like a white piece of rigid satin cloth. Assorted characters of death and blight mixed ready to begin the morning rite, like the ingredients of a witch's broth. A snowdrop spider. Look at the image there. A snowdrop spider, a flower like a froth, and dead wings carried like a paper kite. What had that flower to do with being white? The wayside blue and innocent heel-all? What brought the kindred spider to that height? What brought the kindred spider? Let's see what happens. So there is the heel-all, which is supposed to be blue and innocent, but it's weirdly white. And then at the same time, there comes a kindred spider to that height, and then steered the white moth thither in the night. Okay, now I'm going to pause the reading of the poem here just to show you how beautifully those images stack up one on top of the other. The white heel-all, the spider, and then the moth, like one on top of the other. There's a piling of images, right? And then he asks this very strange question. What but design of darkness to appall, if design governs in a thing so small? Okay, so we will move on to discussing the themes and the ideas of it. But before we do that, tell me, can you visualize what this poet is trying to do, especially through the color, his use of color and the way he piles one thing on top of the other? So there's the flower, and then on top of that, a moth comes, and then, so this idea of everything suddenly coming into place like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, right? It's like completely disparate, separate pieces. There's a flower, there's a spider, and then there's a moth. And in a very weird coincidence, all of these things are very uncannily at a moment in time coming together. And how does this speak to the modernist experience is the question that we are thinking about in this poem. Okay, so we're going to look at form, techniques, and themes here as well. So again, now the reason I pulled up these two poems side by side is both are Petrarchan sonnets, very distinctly different in style, handling thematic subject matter in vastly different ways, but the form remains the same. So it's the Petrarchan sonnet. But in now Robert Frost, remember we discussed he, as opposed to Eliot and his peers, instead of looking at the urban landscape, he looks at nature, he looks at the natural landscape. So, but he belongs to the modernist era where everything is about experimentation, kind of breaking down the rules, changing what the changing what you were taught or what you were supposed to follow, so breaking away from tradition. So look what he's done to the Petrarchan sonnet. It's still a sonnet in the same form as a Petrarchan one, but it's an atypical or a modified sonnet. So how? Okay, let's go to where we were talking about. Okay, so the Petrarchan sonnet, I don't know if you guys heard me, but I was describing how the Petrarchan sonnet here that Frost is using is an atypical or a modified form of the sonnet. Okay, why I am saying this is because even though Robert Frost, as we know, as a modernist writer, he was experimenting with form, even though he was writing about the natural landscape and describing natural scenarios. While using a form, he was experimenting with it and trying to break away from it in certain ways, which is very typical of the modernist writers, right? So in order to see how this is an atypical Petrarchan sonnet, kind of try to look at the differences in style, theme, and form. Okay, so one very clear, one very predominant one is clearly the 14 lines in the two sections do break in the way of a Petrarchan sonnet into the octave and then the sestet. There are the 8 lines, and then there's the sestet afterwards. But the rhyming scheme, which is traditionally, remember we spoke about it, it was supposed to be ABB, ABBA, but then something like CDE, CDE, or CDCCE, something with more like a different rhyme incorporated. But what Frost does is he picks up on the same A rhyming scheme here. So he picks it up in the sestet and does a different break with tradition where he uses AC, AACC, which is not a rhyming scheme that is traditionally used in a Petrarchan sonnet. That's what I wanted to say, right? So the idea of the volta, what we were saying about the volta being a dramatic shift, I want you guys to compare Wordsworth's sonnet and Frost's sonnet and the two of them together and to see what is the dramatic shift in tone, argument, or focus that you can see. Now, in Wordsworth's, like we discussed, there was a clear indication of sort of like the imagery changing, right? It changed from the snowdrop, the snow, the whiteness, the whole world being white and blasted with snowstorms and winter breezes. It changed to suddenly blue-eyed May. It became blue-eyed May, and the color scheme changed. It was blue, bright yellow jonquils. There were jonquil flowers blossoming up, and all these sort of tactile visual imagery came into play. But was there a big change in Wordsworth describing an argument? Was there some sort of an argument or a shift in perspective in that poem? So think about it, go back to it and think. In Frost, however, there is a very marked shift. Now, as opposed to Wordsworth's poem, Frost's, when you're reading the octave and the sestet, there's like a clear break. Let's go back to it and take a look at it, right? So it shifts from presenting or describing the scene and it moves to actually questioning the implications, right? So let's see. So look at this first 8 lines, which are the octave. It's entirely about building and describing the scene that he's seeing, right? So I found, the poet is immediately placing himself in the scene. I found a dimpled spider, fat and white. And look at this imagery. Like, you must have noted this. Usually dimpled is used for whom? Who do we use the word dimpled on usually? It's on a baby. right? Generally, we say that a baby is the one that he's giving a very dimpled smile or a dimpled grin. And look at fat and white. Doesn't that give like the sort of image of like a newborn, chubby, chonky baby, like a fat and white dimple? What a weird image to use for a spider, right? And then there's a white heel all. So a heel all is traditionally supposed to be in medicine in European countries and in North American countries. Heel, the whole point why it's named a heel all is this flower is supposed to be used as a medicine. So what is medicine essentially, if you think about it? Is it a symbol of death or a symbol of life? So if you medicate something, whether it's a wound or an illness, you are extending life, right? So these, if you kind of look at it, you see that these are kind of images of life. There is a fat, white, dimpled baby kind of spider. There is a white heel all, which is supposedly a symbol of regeneration and healing. But it's suddenly holding up a moth, and then the imagery changes to a rigid satin cloth. When you think of those words, like what sort of visual imagery is Frost trying to create here? A white piece of rigid satin cloth. Think of rigid and satin. What do those words bring to mind? Like for me, this kind of gives the sense of the inner lining of a coffin or a funeral shroud. Haven't you, doesn't that sound familiar? Haven't you seen that silky satiny lining inside like a coffin? Or so there's this idea of a shroud. So suddenly it takes on a very funereal, like a very deathly connotation, right? And then he immediately goes on to reassert that by saying, yes, characters of death and blight, okay? And they are all mixed ready to begin the morning, right? Like the ingredients of a witch's broth. So he is continuing those images. You can see how he's building up on the like the bigger image or the bigger visual image of now it's almost like there's a cauldron and we are putting one after the other these very sort of malignant kind of things, like a white moth, a white spider. You can almost imagine like this as a scene from Macbeth, right? Where the three witches are, where they're meeting on the heath and they're going like eye of newt and toe of frog, and they're all like dancing around the fire. So it's something similar. Look at it, a white spider, a white heel all, and a white moth, right? And then again, there's the juxtaposition of things of that are supposedly unnatural or evil with those ideas of beauty or sort of innocence or chastity that we were talking about, like snowdrop spider. There's a snowdrop spider. First the spider is like a fat and white baby, then he's like a snowdrop, and then the flower is like froth. So froth, either froth on the top of milk. When milk is froth, you get this like layer of creamy froth on top of it, or else the froth on top of a sea wave. Sometimes you've seen froth on the sea waves, right? So all of these are, there's a mixing of imagery, same like this witch's broth where different things are being mixed in. And then but the moth's dead wings are like a paper kite. Again, not a super malignant image, right? A paper kite, it could be pretty. A paper kite is often pretty. Imagine like flying like a nice white kite in a blue sky. So it's not, there's a mix of sort of like funeral and death imagery, and then there's a mix of like kind of innocent and beautiful images as well, right? But look at by the sestet. Now again, like this marked break is also, I think, interesting here, because as far as I know or remember, I don't think Wordsworth's sonnet, it didn't have a break in between, right? It's just a sonnet. The 14 lines are like going at a stretch one after the other. But Frost has written this with the break. So there is the octave, and then it doesn't continue immediately afterwards. There's like a gap in between. So what happens with the sestet? Suddenly it goes, what had that flower to do with being white? Okay, that's a very strange and interesting question. So it's almost like he's accusing the flower. Like, it's almost like, what business did that flower have to be white? It was not supposed to be white. It's like a freak of nature. It's like something very uncanny. Why is it white? It's not supposed to be white. The wayside blue and innocent heel all. Now, the reason I highlighted this for you guys is it's interesting for me because the color white in Wordsworth was used for innocence, right? So there was the white snowdrop that for Wordsworth was the idea of chastity, of innocence, of this very sort of like gentle, benevolent kind of a image, right? But for Frost, he's subverting this white color, and for him, blue and innocent is the original heel all. So if the original flower that is like a deep purplish blue, that is innocence. And the moment that flower becomes white by some change in nature, it's supposed to be uncanny. It's not, it's sort of like a freak of nature and something that's not supposed to be there, right? And then he says, what brought the kindred spider to that height? So if he's describing the flower in negative connotations, now this is not the blue and innocent heel all he's talking about. If he's talking about the white flower being weird or uncanny or unnatural and kind of like freakish, he says, what brought the kindred spider to that height? So the spider is also, what does kindred mean? What do you mean when you say it's a kindred spirit? So someone who is similar to you, someone who is also the same, right? So if the flower is freakish and uncanny, the kindred spider, the spider is also freakish and uncanny, and he manages to come on top of the flower. And then it steered the white moth thither in the night. So all these three factors are coming together in this very eerie and sort of weirdly timed scenario, right? And so in the sestet, suddenly from describing a scene, it moves immediately to questions. What had that flower to do with being there? Who brought that kindred spider to that height? What steered the white moth? So there's like the very questioning, persistent, like sort of like a argumentative tone, right? Like who did this? Why? Who dared do this? Like why did this happen this way? And then he comes to a conclusion sort of, which is also through like another rhetorical question, is like, if all these things came together, if such a design is governing such a thing so small. So at this particular time, there was a eerie white heel. At the same time, a spider came. At the same time, the spider came and caught the moth, and death is present there. If all these things came together in this light, what but design of darkness to appall? So there is a design of darkness here. So nature as a not a very nice or sublime like characteristic, right, that he gives to nature. So that brings us to this. So in as opposed to Frost and how he views nature, is nature here portrayed as kind, benevolent, and gentle? Or is it actually the opposite? Do you get the sense that nature here is an impassive? What is impassive? Impassive means unfeeling. It will just let whatever happens to you, whatever happens, and it has no emotion or investment or kindness towards you, right? And do you get the sense that there is like a sinister or possibly evil mechanism at work here, right? So go back to the poem later and look at or for the contrast, right? And then is this a message of optimism? Now, in Wordsworth, we were looking at how the snowdrop appearing through the snow, all of these things are so, it's like a harbinger of hope, right? There is this sense of optimism. Things will get better no matter how difficult things are, or no matter how bad the winter, spring is going to come. But what happens in Frost? Now, again, bringing us back to the idea that Frost is experimental. He's a modernist. He's not like a romantic writer. So there's the idea of the pessimistic note, right? The idea of an unfeeling, cruel design. So there's something very unfeeling about nature. It's cruel. It's sadistic even. It doesn't care what happens to you. Where do you think all these ideas are coming from? Where do you think this mood is coming from for Frost, right? This is where it's important to think of the poet in context of the larger world, like what is happening around him. So when you think of nature as an ominous, dangerous force, focus again on the descriptions that Frost uses, right? Like we were exploring, and the use of the color white. Now, this color white here is so interesting in comparison and contrast to the color white used in Wordsworth's poem. Okay? So what is Frost's design, this poem? What is it actually trying to get at? Is it getting at this idea of things happening at the wrong time at the wrong place? Was the moth did the moth come and land on the white heel all at the wrong time when the white spider was there? Is it a mechanism where something went wrong, or is everything at the right time at the right place? Was the moth supposed to be there? Was the spider supposed to be there at that exact moment? So this is where he is coming up with this idea of a design of darkness. Okay. So the idea that nature is actually not benevolent or sweet or sublime, like for example, a romantic would have argued. Frost, on the other hand, is saying that there's a design of darkness at work here. Okay. So nature is associated with death and destruction, which immediately kind of brings you to question the existence of a benevolent creator. So if such things of destruction come together at the right time like this to ensure the death of something, in this case the moth, can there be a benevolent creator out there? Is this God's design? Is this meant to happen in this way? So it's interesting in terms of a Christian or a Catholic perspective. It would be difficult for them to grasp because they believe in the idea of a creator. But think about how this comes to light in maybe a Buddhist context. What about the idea of karma, right? Like, do things happen in a set way because that's what it was meant to happen? Or is everything just a freak accident? Do things happen by accident and it's like an ungovernable world where random things happen and we don't know what might happen? So think about all these questions in terms of this idea of the mood of the era, right? The modernist era where world wars were happening, all this aimless, senseless destruction, and all of these, I don't know, death and decay and I don't know, just overall destruction that was happening around them. So it will bring you into the mood of the current world where we are in at the moment with all these things that are happening with this US, Israel, the war they have instigated on Iran, and all of these global events that are happening. So I want you to just ponder, think of a present day example from current events, okay? From what's happening in the world around you. Think of something like what is Frost is describing. You guys think for yourself and see if you can come up with something. But for me, it feels like almost like the white moth happening to be on the white heel all at the time that the white spider appeared there. You can imagine the notion of those school children in that school in Iran, which was bombed by the US. Like, were those children supposed to be there? Were they supposed to be there at that moment when that bomb hit from the sky? Was that the right timing? Was that what nature was supposed to be doing? So do you see the connections? Do you see where the modernist thinking is coming from? Where they're like, this is so senseless. None of this makes sense. Why is so much death happening around us? So I just think about those things in terms of, I think it's a good time for you guys to get into sort of like the modernist mentality and understand it better, because as opposed to a romantic era where you're just like going around looking at flowers and be like, oh my God, like everything's so pretty. Right now we are kind of reliving more of a modernist time in human history, right? So think about those. And then we go back to the poem afterwards. I'm not going to lead you guys on this, but you guys go back and do a technique hunt again. Look for structure. Look for the strong color-coded imagery which we were discussing. Look what sort of images are brought out, visual images. Are there tactile images? I think there are tactile images. I don't think there's olfactory images so much, but definitely tactile images are there. That rigid satin cloth, paper kite, like the tissue-like feeling of the moth's wings, right? What is the symbolism in the poem? And what is juxtaposition? Juxtaposition is putting two things together at the same time, so that you can see how contrasting, basically like a compare and contrast, and generally to contrast with each other, right? So what are the juxtapositions there? And this, very interestingly, which is nowhere near Wordsworth, rhetorical question. So there's a lot of philosophical musings like we looked at in this last sestet, there are all these questions. Look at this. There's like 3 questions in those 6 lines. He's questioning the flower, he's questioning the spider, he's questioning the moth, and then he's questioning the overall design of all of this. Okay? So that's also interesting for you guys to look at. Let's see what I had pulled up for you next. Okay. So think about this thing that I have put up here in this speech bubble. Reflect on this question. How do we as humans, or we as a society, how do we ascribe? What is ascribe? Ascribe is sort of like you pin or you denote certain meanings or associations to abstract objects and concepts in our world. Okay? So the world around us is just existing. So flowers bloom, clouds pass by, wars happen, peace happens, rivers rise, I don't know, storms come. The world is existing, but who is it that decides that something is either good and something is bad? So the reason I'm asking you is to really think about why we as people tend to give certain associations to objects or concepts in our world. For example, why is the snowdrop a symbol of hope? Okay? And what I have put down for you here, we've pulled some of the main images in the 2 poems that you looked at side by side, the To a Snowdrop by Wordsworth and Design by Robert Frost. We have the same color white. Remember I told you to look at the idea of white in those 2 poems? So there's the idea of white, but in the first poem, there's the white of the snowdrop and white of snow. How is this white? How is the white of the snowdrop different from the white of the heel-all flower? Okay, so the snowdrop is also a flower. It's white, but a white snowdrop is a symbol of pureness and chastity and hope and renewal. But a heel-all, which is also a flower, the moment that flower is white, it becomes weird, it's unnatural, it's a symbol of death. Oh my god, there's something so wrong with it. Like, how is this same color being given 2 different connotations, right? Why is a white snowdrop, why is a white heel-all not chaste and like a symbol of hope? We can prescribe it like that, right? We can give that meaning to it. So think about those things. So what are the associations with white as a snowdrop versus white as a heel-all? Why is one a harbinger of spring and the other is a harbinger of death? Okay? And then think about the white of snow in Wordsworth's poem. Well, the white of snow as well. What does that white connote? And there's a little, just a side story to tell you guys. There's a very pretty, in German folklore, apparently there's a story that the snowdrop, about how the snowdrop came to be and be the first flower to bloom. When the world was made, snow, when it appeared, it didn't have a color. So apparently snow was colorless. And he asked around from the rest of the flowers whether he could borrow their color for himself because he didn't have a color of his own. And all the other flowers sort of turned up their noses to him and they were like, no, we're not going to share our color with you. And the snowdrop apparently is the only flower who took pity on snow and let him share the color, like the snowdrop's color white. So in return for that, apparently, is why snow or nature has allowed the snowdrop to be the first flower to bloom after winter when all of the other flowers are still dead or still haven't bloomed. So that's just like I thought it was a pretty bit of German folklore. But really think of that idea of color. How do we prescribe these meanings or symbolism to color, right? And then in the second poem, think of how white appears in other images. There's the white of the heel-all, the white of the moth, and the white of the spider. So how come the color white here is uncanny, it's freakish, it's associated with death? And meanwhile, blue is considered innocent, okay? But white is suddenly ominous. How did white become an ominous color all of a sudden? It's supposed to be a pure, innocent color, right? Who decided that a spider or a moth were characters of death and blight? harbingers of darkness and evil. These are all social constructs. The reason I want you guys to think about these is just to show you how society as a whole decides that these are kind of symbols or ideas that we give to certain things. So think about the idea of a moth and a butterfly. Why is a moth always associated as a dark omen or something unlucky or unpretty? And then there's a butterfly, and everyone's super happy if it's a butterfly. It's supposed to be a good symbol and an idea, right? Just putting it out there for you to rack your brains, because I'm really trying to stretch your brains here and think about things in a different way, right? Okay, I have something little that I want you guys to do. It's going to be an activity. Okay, we're going to do this. I'm going to give you, I'll read this out to you, and then I'll give you like, I want to say 5 minutes to get ready and prepare. And then I want you to read out what you have gotten ready. And by that time, the time might run out. So rejoin from the link. So I've put up a little thought for you here. So imagine this scene. After a long period of drought, the first monsoon rains have arrived. Okay, this is here in Sri Lanka. And one morning, when you're out on a walk, you come across a white Aralia flower on its tree. Okay, it's the first one of the season and it's blooming all alone. Then, as you watch, a brilliant blue butterfly comes and lands on the flower. Okay? Now, these are the two things I want you to do. One, imagine that you are a romantic era writer. Okay? Think about what effect would this scene have on you. You're out for a walk right after the rain. You see a beautiful Aralia flower blooming, and then a beautiful blue butterfly comes and lands on it. What sort of emotional response would you have to this scene? Then think about what techniques would you use to write a poem about what you just witnessed. If you were writing a poem about this and you were a romantic poet, what techniques would you use? How would you describe this scene? So name 3 of those and describe your poem briefly. Okay? You can take that down if you want. Just note it down. You don't have to write the entire thing. Just note down what you're supposed to do. So I want you to think of yourself as a romantic writer. Think about the emotional effect this scene would have, and just name 3 techniques and how would you approach this poem? How are you going to write this poem? Okay? And secondly, I want you to imagine you're a modernist writer. Okay, now you're no longer romantic, you're in a modernist era where bombs are dropping, death and destruction, all this misery is around you. And you see this same scene. Nothing about the scene has changed. It's the exact same scene after the monsoon rains. You're taking a walk, beautiful Aralia flower, butterfly comes and sits on it. How would you write a poem about this scene that you just witnessed? Okay? Name 3 literary devices you're going to use to describe this scene to us, and then describe the outline of your poem to us briefly. Okay? If you can, try to do both, but if you don't have time, pick one. Would you like to write this as a romantic era or as a modernist writer? Pick one and jot it down for now. The other one you can do for homework or later. And yeah, start thinking. I'm going to mute myself now, but I will be asking you guys in 5 minutes. Okay? Okay, I see some stuff from the chat. What's happening? Okay. You can have more time. I'll give you a little bit more. Kunari has just bombarded the messages. See what you guys have come up with. Okay. Let's see who would like to go first. So one of you can, what is this? One of you guys can decide, when you start, you can decide, to tell me which era you chose. which writer you decided you were going to be, and then you can, if you've done both, you can also discuss both if you like, but you're free to pick one and just tell me. So who would like to go first? Shall I call out somebody, or would you guys like to start somebody voluntarily? Let's see if there's a brave person who wants to go first. Is anyone feeling particularly brave? You guys don't need to write your entire poem, okay? Like, you can perfect it later in your own time. I just want the gist of it. I just want to know what your ideas of, and if you manage to place yourself in the head of this era writer and how you're approaching it. That's all that I'm looking for. I'm not asking you to recite like the entire poem you've written. Would Methuli be done?
I genuinely don't know if I'm from the modernist or the romantic era. It's just like I wrote random questions that just came into my mind.
Okay.
Okay.
And
So
now you're trying to figure out which era you belong to?
I guess it's modernist.
Okay.
For the technique,
Yeah.
maybe some visual imagery on the butterfly and the flower.
Okay. What type of imagery is what I'm interested in? What sort of images are you drawing from?
Can I just read the questions that I like randomly popped up in my head?
Yeah, go for it.
I wrote, will the blue in your wings last long? Did you steal the yellow from the sun that burned you?
Okay.
Why are you still so pure and white? How are you still holding on? And are you oblivious of what's going to happen to you, or do you already know?
Okay. Good.
Didn't it burn you enough? And finally, you're probably going to be gone soon.
Okay, very bleak, but okay, I get what you're getting at. That's good. That's good. So, from what you have described of yourself, I think you should be able to answer what era what mood or atmosphere you're kind of embodying. Do you feel that this is more of romantic era? Are you embodying the feeling of the sublime and how beautiful nature is and how you're connecting to it? Or are you attaching yourself more to the idea of alienated, disconnected, like fragmented, meaningless, like an atmosphere or an emotion? You can answer that question, I think. What do you feel?
I think it's the second one.
It's probably the second, right? Okay, so that's great. I think you've done a really good job, and it'll be interesting for you as an exercise to try to develop the poem, right? Because it will really help you. Like, all this theory is well and good. I don't want you guys to katapadam karanafai and get to know all the theoretical points. I want you to absorb it, see how it kind of affects, and see how it has manifested itself in the works of literature that you do. But I also want you to see how it can impact you. Like, I want you to take away from that the ideas of what we are learning, not just the rote memory and padankala that's not what literature is supposed to be about. So I'm glad that you've gotten to the essence of it. So from what you're describing, I kind of feel you've caught the essence of modernism, and it will be interesting for you to apply this to this poem and keep writing it. So maybe next time, if you guys would be ready to share your poems, that would be amazing. I would be really happy to listen to those and see what you. It's not a test. It's just a nice exercise to see whether you have grasped the key concepts, right? Okay. Maybe since Tisuri was still working and Setuki too, Kinuri, can I have you go next, please?
Can I just recite the poem?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's still a sketch though.
That's all right. You can work on it later.
It bloomed wide with a blend of sunlight within its pure white petals, eager for any hands to reach out, to be plucked and kept as a symbol of devotion. Yet the only companion who flapped its bright blue wings was a lonely butterfly caught by either the fragrance or the solitude of the flower.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, that's great. So tell me, explain your poem a little bit to me. Now, I am a student. I am brand new, and you are a grand writer, and I'm just learning your text for the first time. How would you explain your work to me? Do you think you're writing more as a romantic writer or as a modernist writer?
I think the approach is supposed to be modernist, but the language kind of turned out to be like more in the romantic.
Okay,
type.
that's interesting. It's a mix of genres, is what you're saying. So I would like to ask you, when you say the language is turning out more towards romantic, what are you implying? Explain that more to me.
I think I described the physical appearance of the flower and the elements more in a positive light, like kind of romanticizing the language. So I think that's
Okay, so see through the exercise, see that this is what I want to see. So I can see that you've grasped the idea of the what is a romantic writer, what is the notion of romanticism, this idea of sublime imagery, beautifully idealized nature. So you've grasped the key concepts, right? So those are those concepts that you're translating into your poem, which is great. And I think it's perfectly fine to be a mix of two genres, like lots of us, especially in the current context, like postmodern world and writing, there's a lot of genre mixing and all of that. So I think that's great. Keep working on your poems, and then maybe like next time we can discuss them, and that'll be really interesting. Can we have Setuki?
I don't have like an entire poem like figured out or anything. I just have like the outline, I guess.
That's okay. That's perfect.
It's basically like how the poem would go. So since like white is considered pure in like the romantic era, I would like to write a poem in which even though it's like a lone flower, even though the blue butterfly comes to meet the lone flower, since like white is only considered pure and blue is sort of not into pure, um a blue butterfly landing on that flower would mean something like impurity or damaging the purity of the flower, or it can be seen as an outside force like invading the piece of the world which is like personified as the white flower. Maybe something like that.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think that's a very interesting concept you've got there. Would you say that's more of a romantic feel that you're capturing or a modernist feel?
Maybe more of a romantic, I guess.
Okay, a romantic concept. I get what you're trying to say. So, like, because the white flower is like a symbol of purity and devotion. But what about the idea that you're trying to say about blue coming in as impure, and the idea of invasion, the idea of sort of like, even though these are objects of nature, the idea that something is impurifying something else. Do you see that there could be a slight touch of modernist ideas coming in there as well? Do you sense that?
Like while like having inspiration for these, I kind of used both poems, so I feel there is a little bit of a mixture of both.
Okay, interesting. I like what you guys are doing with this. It's very cool. So I think we had Thisuri left. Let's have Thisuri tell us what she has come up with.
I kind of wrote something, but I'm not sure it's good.
No, that's complete.
Yeah, it goes like, as the monsoon winds approach, I sensed you near, a bittersweet feeling that time couldn't erase. And when I finally saw you, I felt as if everything fell into place.
Okay, is that your poem?
Yeah,
Okay, nice. So your images, your techniques, and your overall emotion, romantic or modernist?
I felt it's romantic.
I also felt it's more romantic. Yeah, that's great. So you've captured the essence of it. So now you know what it is like to be a romantic writer, writing with that sort of images and emotions in you. So you have captured that well. So that's great. Now look at that, guys. Like four of you came up. There's only four, right? Did I miss anybody? No, it looks like it's four of you. So the four of you came up with four completely different aspects and either genres or forms. Or do you see how beautifully like the mix happens? So why it's so important is, rather than approaching these things as things you have to study or things that you have to get into your memory to analyze a poem, get into the heart of the poem. What is this poet trying to say? Where is this background coming from? Where are these ideas stemming from? What's happening in the world around us, that or around them when these poets were writing? What was happening in the world around them at the time, right? Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes, although in future when you're learning literature to a more advanced degree, sometimes this approach comes with its mix of both good and bad. But it is sometimes useful to look at the biographical aspects of a writer, because some writers, obviously, you're drawing from life, right? Literature doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not something that just blooms out of nowhere. So it's well, I think it's a good thing, don't you, Metuli? I think it's a great thing. Do you mind if I read out your message out loud?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So Mithili has sent on the chat that she feels that you're kind of exposing yourselves through this assignment. And I think that is very interesting. And that's a really good point that you're bringing up there, because what is literature in the end? What are all writers doing when they write something? They're exposing themselves. They are exposing the inner workings of their mind, what is going on in their minds, what is important to them, what sort of thoughts do they have, what is their worldview, how do they see the world, right? So writing as an act is essentially exposure. You're putting yourself out there on the page. The moment you write something and make it available for public viewing or share it with people, you are literally showing your soul. So that's what writing is about, and I'm glad that you picked up on that and that you made a point about it. But I hope you guys enjoyed that exercise, and I hope it was helpful for you to grasp the concepts better. We'll revisit them as we progress into other poems as well. Now let me see. Let me minimize this guy first, and then let me see what okay. Next slide is, so to recap, I think this is our final slide. To recap, I've just put a sort of summary of all that we've discussed today. So we looked at two poems. Remember, we looked at Wordsworth, two poets from two different eras, from two different countries too this time, which is different to what we were doing last time, because we were looking specifically at the British poets. Okay, so just to recap, when you're reading a work, try to situate it in the era or its socio-historical context in order to get a clearer understanding. However, like I was telling before as well, keep in mind that these are just broad categorizations. Do not generally ever try to box yourself into things saying, okay, romantic era, this, like this is what it's supposed to be, modernist era. Remember, we were discussing that even within the same era, different poets can have different styles. And in the activity that you guys just did, you can see that even you can mix genres, like there can be elements of different genres seeping into a work, right? It's not as clear cut as black and white. Okay, so don't study them as strict categories, but really keep them in mind just to get a clearer understanding. So when look at these, for example, think of the differences in style, theme, and devices between two romantic poets who we studied, Blake and Wordsworth. Both romantics, but different styles of writing, right? And then also spend some time comparing and contrasting the same concept between two modernist ones. So we looked at Eliot, we looked at Frost. How does Eliot handle his themes as a modernist writer? How does Frost do it? What are the similarities? What are the differences? Okay. Again, look closely at how different poets handle the same subject matter. And also remember that a poem or a work of literature is a text on its own. Okay? This is something that I've been reiterating to you guys since the start of our sessions. A work of literature is a text on its own. It just stands. There is no set meaning to it. There is no prescriptive idea. You are the one bringing your thoughts and interpretations and meanings into it. So you as the reader ascribe meaning to it. Similar to how we as people or we as a society or individuals ascribe meaning to a color. Okay? Who says white is good? Who says white is bad? If you even think about the differences just in simple cultures, in our culture, like in Sri Lankan or like in Buddhist or Christian culture in Sri Lanka, if there's a funeral, people wear white, right? White is known as a color of mourning and of death and like a symbolizing death. In other contexts, in Western or European contexts, death or a funeral signifies black. Nobody wears white. It's black. Black is the color of mourning. So who decides this? Who decides white is pure and black is mourning? Or what if black is pure? Like what if we all start saying that black is the color of chastity and innocence? And do you get what I'm trying to get at? So there is no set meaning. So always remember that you are allowed to interpret things and you are the one bringing the meaning to the text. So moving on to the last slide, and next time I hope I can see your poems and we can maybe do a little bit of a reading of those. But next time you see an Aralia flower, really look close and think of the different meanings and symbolism that you have ascribed to it. Now, the reason I say this is, to me, now the Aralia being white and being a flower that we are very familiar with, this is the closest that we can think of in terms of a snowdrop. Snowdrops are not things that grow in our countries and they have no emotional significance for us. But the Aralia flower is very complex and intriguing in that idea because on one hand, it's a flower symbolizing purity, fragrance, chastity, and it's the flower that it's basically called a temple flower, right? Aralia, another name is temple flower in English. We use it for puja, we use it to worship Lord Buddha or like to worship gods or whatever. It's used as a flower of worship. But at the same time, have you guys heard? I'm sure you must have heard this, and this is something that really used to annoy me when I was young. Aralia flowers, white Aralia trees are not allowed to be grown in gardens traditionally in our country in Sri Lanka, because they are supposed to symbolize death and bring ill fortune or something. There is some folklore about it because they are white, associated with death, and also the idea that Aralia trees do grow in graveyards, like in graveyards and cemeteries, we do see white Aralia trees a lot. So on the one hand, there is this idea of the Aralia flower as a chaste and fragrant and like a symbol of devotion and purity, and then there's the idea that it's unlucky and it shouldn't be planted in a house. This used to enrage me when I was young because I really wanted a white Aralia tree in our house because I love those flowers and I love the smell. But my parents were like, no, you cannot plant white Aralia. It's a very unfortunate thing to do and you can't have it in a household. So think about the meanings, cultural meanings that you have ascribed to it, right? So just to wrap up, I hope you complete your poem in the romantic or modernist style. And if you feel inspired, write 2 different poems in the 2 different styles and then compare it for yourself and see what you feel about it, right? Experiment around and see what you come up with. So till next time, I hope you guys enjoyed your class. I'm going to stop sharing. Before I wrap up, were there any questions? Is there anything that you wanted clarified? Something you didn't understand or that you would want? Okay, I love that, Setuki. So Setuki's mom has decided she doesn't care. Props to Setuki's mom. I really like that approach. And she has decided she doesn't care what people say and planted lots of white Aralia trees in her garden, which is amazing. I would love that. So yeah, do any of you guys have questions or anything that you want clarified of the 2 poems? Was everything clear? Did you have any questions?
I have one.
Yes. What is it?
Could there be a political meaning, like a underlying political meaning in the poem design?
Okay, underlying political, how so? What do you think is the underlying political meaning? Let's dive into that a little bit.
About this, like the spider trying to hunt the moth and all that stuff. Like there's someone powerful, and then there's someone who has no power at all, and then like he's taking advantage of this person, and then it's like it's the way it is supposed to be. That's like the normal chain. That's how life goes, and all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Also, again, remember context of which he was writing. What was the context? Wars, post-war, right? And similarly, try to place if it was in the political context today, how would it be the same? How would it differ, right? So drawing on the image or drawing on the image that you were bringing up in the question, we have US and Israel getting together to attack Iran, which did not in any way. Now it's been there's clear evidence and it's been proven that they were not about to initiate any sort of a nuclear threat, or they were not going to do anything aggressive, right? But these two countries get together and attack. So why are these two white spiders getting together to attack a moth that just happened to be sitting on a white like heel all flower, right? So this idea, like the greater context of the time, the political context obviously comes in. What is this death and destruction? Where are these? Who is dropping bombs on who? Are these people capable of fighting back? Do they have the power? Like the idea of an ominous, like not a like a evil or sinister force at work, right? This spider and all of these things conspiring together to trap and attack like a creature that was literally doing nothing wrong. So definitely there are political connotations, definitely probably war related existential themes that are being discussed. And Frost is writing in a politically aggravated, politically turbulent time, same as Eliot. So similar topics are covered definitely with political underpinnings, and you can interpret it in any way. Like at the end of the day, none of us are really going to know what the writer meant when he was writing something. I did want to pull up something for you guys. Let me see if I have that. Give me 1 second. Let's see. Yeah, just before we wrap up, I wanted to show you. So initially, remember I said that by mistake I showed you something else for Wordsworth's poem. So apparently, Frost's poem was initially called In White. This is the original poem. You can see the screen, right? Very interestingly, this was the first version of the poem. It was not Design. Okay, I'm throwing these out there for you guys to think about, like why these changes happened. So the first version of Frost's poem was actually in white. So you can see it's the same images, a dented spider. Now can you see the dented spider in the first version became a dimpled spider by the second one. Okay, but what is he doing like when he's refining the images like this? Think of it even in terms of like a political sense. What are the political sort of underpinnings that he is doing with these changes? A dented spider like a snowdrop white on a white heel all holding up a moth like a white piece of lifeless satin cloth. And then remember in the poem we are actually studying, it's rigid, right? Rigid satin cloth. Potent in little ingredients in which is brought beady spider, and the moth carried like a paper kite. And look at the second sestet is quite different. It says, what had the flower to do with being white? What is this in the chat? Did somebody have something to say? Okay, I will check this in a minute. What had the flower to do with being white? The blue prunella, every child's delight. I don't really know what prunella is. Maybe it's a different name for Helol. What brought the kindred spider to that height? What are these? Like, look at these lines. Make we no thesis of the miller's plight. What is this miller here? Like, what is he getting at? Is it a reference to the spider? This idea of a thesis, like, let us make no, what is it to have a thesis? A thesis is something to make a definitive argument about something, to say that this is what X means, right? So what but design of darkness and of night? Design. Do I use the word aright? Now, can you see how curious that is? In the first version of the poem, he says, design, do I use the word aright? Am I using this word properly, right? He's questioning it. And then the second version of the poem, which is the finalized, the refined version, and the version that we study, it says that the title itself is design. Do you see how interesting that is? So in the first version, he was questioning whether the word is even correct. Do I use the word aright? And then it moves on to say, like, the second version of the poem is actually design. So he has decided that the word is right. So just something I wanted to throw out for you guys. But let me see what Thisuri had said. So Thisuri says that why Wordsworth claims it to be a lone flower intentionally in his poem. Maybe he was subtly hitting at the immortality of human beings and the changes that occur in nature. Basically, nothing stays the same. And if we face challenges like the snowdrop, there would be brighter days ahead. And yeah, that could be definitely a possible interpretation of it. So the lone snowdrop, like one person against the world, right? So that could be an interpretation where he is looking at how a single individual or a single person has to face all these adversities and all these storms of life, and giving us the idea or the hope and the optimism that if we persevere, things might actually work out and better days are up ahead. So that's a good interpretation too. Okay, great. Do you guys have any more questions, or shall we wrap up for today? Anything else? All clear? Okay, I'll take that as a yes, that everything's clear, and know that no more questions. So I will see you guys next time then. Hope this was all clear. And again, if you have any questions, just pass it on or drop a message and I can address those next time. Okay, thanks then, guys. Hope you had a good evening and stay safe and have a good night.
Thank you so much.